Hi, everybody. I am Chad Collins here with Mick Garris for Dread Central, and today we are going to be talking about the underappreciated, I think, gem, Writing the Bullet, a King adaptation that I think does some pretty remarkable stuff with like grief and the paranormal and the way it sort of influences and infects our mind. So to start, I wanted to ask, having done a little bit of more research on just the origins and conception of Writing the Bullet, when it came to adapting that, because I know you've done a lot of other really seminal King adaptations. Sleepwalkers, for instance, is one of my favorites, with
Thank
King's
you.
script for that. And that was one of those ones just growing up that I was always watching. For some
Thank
reason,
you.
it was like a cable TV perennial. It was on and I loved it.
Terrible
But
parenting, but
yeah,
congratulations.
that is a King trope, not very fond of parents. Um, So with Riding the Bullet, it was interesting to me because I hadn't known this before, but it was one of the first widely available ebooks, that novella, when that was released.
It
So when
was
it
the
came to,
first one ever written by a major published author.
yeah, which is super cool stuff to, especially in the current day, to think back to that, even back in 2000, that wasn't something that was so accessible. But with the likes of The Stand or The Shining, I just wanted to see what was it like adapting something like that, Writing the Bullet versus some of his other more seminal works that you've been involved with.
Well, it was really different because it was a 30-page short story once you see it on paper rather than online. And it had so much flexibility to it. It was the first thing he wrote after his tragic accident back in 1999. And it resonated with me because I'd recently lost a brother and a parent. And this was kind of a Sophie's choice of a ghost story. And because of the length of it and it not being something that you would normally think of adapting into a feature film, there was so much more flexibility. And it was an opportunity to do what still remains the most personal thing I've ever done. Whereas there was so much room. His story is less than the first half. It's like a third of the movie. And we're very faithful to it, but I set it in a different time, made it a period piece that was something that took place in 1969, which is when I felt that the country had a Sophie's choice to make as far as political and social events and the like. And they were going through the same kind of turmoil that Alan Parker goes through in King's story. Um, and although it seems like a fairly simple ghost story in the short story, it felt profound to me because I was a guy who was making movies about horror and fear and all that and how much fun it was. And to kind of make it self-reflexive. And when you are confronted with mortality, as very few 21-year-olds are, as Alan Parker is in the story and in the movie, you are surprised. You feel immortal at 21. You don't feel immortal when you've got gray hair when you're my age. But it felt like something personal, and I'd had death confront me face to face through family and friends that I'd lost. And it just had a really strong impact on me, more than just a simple ghost story that it might seem to most people.
Yeah, and definitely from my sort of revisit of it, I found it much, hitting me and impacting me much the same way. As a kid, I thought, David Arquette was scary. He was undead, and some of the jolts and with like the manifestation of death at the beginning. Those were scenes that really resonated with me as a kid, and now that I'm older in my late 20s, it's resonating, I think, on that deeper level, which is the way we process grief and guilt and that sort of impending sense of our own mortality that I think younger people, like Alan Parker in the film, that sort of growing recognition that life does come to an end and it's messy and it's complicated and there's not always easy answers, which additionally made me think about because in the sort of current canon of horror, I don't like to use the term like elevated horror, but that's still one of those
Yeah.
just, it's one of those sticking words that like you just can't escape still.
It's so
Um,
insulting. Yeah.
it really is. And it's always interesting to revisit, I think, earlier works, especially ones that I was fond of as a kid, because, I have this sort of, larger awareness of contemporary horror and just seeing how older works were still accomplishing that same thing. And it just didn't always have, I think, the critical recognition. So with Writing the Bullet, I think that the way it sort of tackled grief and guilt, I don't want to use the term elevated horror, but I think it was accomplishing a lot of what people are looking at the contemporary canon now and saying, oh, horror is aspiring to do so much more. It's probing a little bit deeper, it's probing trauma, it's trying to be that sort of curative experience when in truth it always had been. But what really stuck out to me with Writing the Bullet was that just from my, own familiarity with King and my own relationship with his work, is that it's not that it's necessarily easy work, is they're not easy answers, but there seems to be a little bit clearer line between like right, wrong, here's how we overcome grief, here's how we process our pain. And I liked how complicated Writing the Bullet was in that
Oh,
sense.
thank you.
It
Thank
didn't
you. I
seem
mean,
to have. Mhm.
well,
Go ahead.
that's because it's a personal experience, and personal choices are not easy, and confrontations with mortality and grief and loss are never easy, and they're always more painful. I lost a younger brother when he was 38 years old, and it was hugely painful, but I didn't know how to express it until a couple of years later, losing one of my closest friends who was also a bandmate back in my old band days. And I could not stop sobbing at his funeral, and I was sobbing for him, but I was sobbing for all those unspilled tears for my brother as well. And it became something uncontrollable, which may have been embarrassing, but it was incredibly healthy to finally really face up to loss in a way that I acknowledged it deeply instead of just superficially.
Absolutely. And I think that's really what helps is, I think having that personal angle for me really helped. I think sometimes when filmmakers are trying to address grief and guilt like that, I think there's value in the universality of it because it is a universal experience. But I think sometimes in doing so, you end up with some very pat answers to here's what it really feels like. And Writing the Bullet really hit me like a bullet, in retrospect, looking at it, thinking, wow, this feels a lot unlike, or it feels unlike anything I've really experienced recently, or it's much more profound than I remember.
Well, I
And
really appreciate it because, the attempt was to make my grief something consumable on a level that people would understand, because the primary audience for horror films is young people. And this was exposing, young people are exposed to death and mutilation and all of that stuff in a very entertaining way in the world of horror movies, not in a sense of, this is what it's really like to lose someone that you care about. And King's story had the bones for me to build upon that, something that was really personal to me. um but horror came home in the 70s. It stopped being all about the supernatural and became much more personal, maybe insanely so. um but but when I was originally making and pitching Writing the Bullet, it had fewer horror scenes in it, shock scenes. And the company that decided to finance it kept saying, well, it's got Stephen King's name on it. Can you put more of the horror beats in? And I realized they were right, because those horror beats, they're important to keep the audience engaged. And if you're coming to see a horror movie, if you don't have scary moments in addition to heartfelt moments, it was trying to combine The Shining and Stand By Me in that sense. And so I'm glad that I was encouraged to let the horror blossom within it as well and put in some of those tropes, which makes the real life stuff scarier. I mean, I really love Alan's attempted suicide, because so many things in the story are internal, and it was an experiment to see if I could make something cinematic out of something literary That's why you see two Allens talking to each other instead of a hackneyed little voiceover. But the
Yeah,
idea of the paintings that, and making him an artist, someone who creates and thinks it's really cool to be the Prince of Darkness, painting and drawing really evil, nasty shit, is like being a filmmaker who makes scary movies and sees how far you can go to gross somebody out, suddenly being confronted with the ultimate death, you know?
absolutely. I love that. So to transition then, I think into sort of a capstone for me, sort of the genesis for what got us talking today is we were just revisiting some old Halloween memories and some sort of nostalgic bits. And one of my sort of mentions was growing up with my mom, we watched so much Stephen King. That was
Ah,
all that she's a huge fan of his work and of course by extension your work. She might
oh.
kill me for saying this, but she prefers your The Shining adaptation to Kubrick's just because it's much more faithful.
Well,
um,
thank you to your mom. And hopefully she'll be glad you told me rather than kill you.
yeah. um, so, having grown up watching those, for me, that experience with horror is definitely sort of inextricable from the family component because it was something I started watching with my mom. And I think that's in part why this sort of mother son dynamic in writing the bullet probably hit me so hard because just my whole sort of experience as a horror writer and just a horror fan has been with my mother and within the family. So I wanted to ask you because I know that this is a deeply personal film. You drew a lot from yourself for it, just what that sort of family connection with horror looks like for you now. Is that what is how does that manifest, how do you approach that?
Well, it deepens me as experiencing those losses makes me a better human being and hopefully a better artist as well and a deeper storyteller than ever before. I watched the old Universal classics on TV with my mom. As we were growing up, my parents split up when I was about 12. There was a lot of split within the family. We were not close. And what really brought us back together with that sense of closeness and family was my younger brother was HIV and got full-blown AIDS. And in those days, in 1992, that was a death sentence. And indeed, it was his. And that made a family of four kids and two parents um, appreciate each other once again and realize that life is fragile, even in your 30s when it's not supposed to be. So that experience made me want to tell stories that touched more deeply. And as you probably noticed in the end titles, it's Writing the Bullet is dedicated to both my parents and my brother Craig. Um, and I wanted to tell stories that went beyond a horror audience, the horror audience I'm a part of and who I embrace and whom I love, but to go beyond that to people who maybe don't love horror movies, give them a reason to step into our world and see that we're not just all sadists, we are storytellers, and that we have something on our minds besides just the splat on the screen.
Absolutely, and trust me, as soon as it ended, my rewatch, I called my mom right away. It's like, I just wanna check in and say hi, no reason, I'm not, like, motivated by anything or feeling like
Oh,
a lot
that's
of things
great.
right now.
No, that makes
Um,
me feel great. Has she seen it?
she has yeah, no, she was actually, the one who showed it to me. I
Wow.
was
Oh.
it was a little bit more gruesome than I thought. There's a solid chance when I first saw it, I'd seen it on cable somewhere where it had been
Oh, you know
edited
what?
some.
USA bought the rights for a very low number, but the only way you could see it for 6 years was on the USA network, and they butchered it. And when you go time hopping and reality hopping, as we do in Writing the Bullet, and you cut out chunks of it without any thought or reason just to make time for commercials, it can become very confusing. But I'm sure that's what you saw the first
That
time
has
around.
to be. I tried to look it up to see what I remember. I was like writing the bullet TV airing, and I couldn't find anything. But I was like, this is. It definitely felt, I think, more complete, and it hit harder than I remembered.
Well, there's a lot more to it. I think there was something like 17 minutes that just
Oh my.
randomly yanked out of a 100-minute movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the good old days of very few choices, but watching whatever
Yeah.
TNT or USA decided to air.
Yeah. Yeah. But well, I'm glad you got to see it in its full and complete form.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate it. I encourage everybody to go out and watch Riding the Bullet.
Uh,
It's
Thank you, Chad. It's really great to talk about something that's really close to my heart.
I appreciate it.